You think DEI is dying or has had the final nail in its coffin with the Trump election?
Not nail in the coffin, because they'll just start giving things different names, given that DEI is a euphemism for affirmative action already. Yes, something happened this year. I think that there's going to be a questioning of how large these DEI organizations get and how much effect they have. And notice especially the falling away of the loyalty oaths that new professors were expected to sign in saying that their work is committed to diversity even when they're particle physicists. I was always dreading that somehow I was going to have to sign one of those because, frankly, I wouldn't. I would leave a job rather than do that.
If Daniel Penny had been a police officer, if instead of being a former military service person, he had had a uniform, a police unit of New York's finest, and he had subdued Jordan Penny, wouldn't it be an Eric Garner 2.0 kind of case? Wouldn't the Al Sharpton people, some of whom I gather were chanting outside of the courtroom, have been 10 times as many of them on the streets? And wouldn't the editorial opinion been much less friendly to the guy who subdued Jordan Neely than had proven to be the case here? And what do we have to say about that?
All those black people who were protesting outside of the trial last week would be out there too, exclaiming that we have to understand that Coleman Domingo is innocent. We have to understand that he didn't do it on purpose. Don't put a black man in prison once again without taking his humanity into account. All the people would be furious at the prospect that that person might go to jail. But if it's this blonde white guy, then it's the same story that I've always seen since 1619. It's that reductive thinking again.
Hey, John.
Hey, Glenn.
This is Glenn Loury, and you are watching or listening, or both, to The Glenn Show. John McWhorter teaches at Columbia University and writes for the New York Times. He's my conversation partner. They call it The Glenn Show, but it's really kind of the Glenn and John Show. Every other week we talk. Once a month we answer for paying subscribers questions. We're talking today, and welcome, John.
Thank you, Glenn. Good to be here.
We're at the end of the year, John. Do you have any wisdom about any kind of summary observations about 2024 that strike you as worthy of sharing with the audience?
I'm not the most anniversary/celebratory of people for about 18 different reasons. And so I don't think naturally in terms of what has it been like in 2024. And there's also a part of me that thinks, why would it have been like anything in that particular stretch of time, despite what the calendar makes it look like? But I guess since last January, I have often been struck by the way certain kinds of people, and I guess I'm at the point where I'm thinking of it as much on the right as the left, are inclined to demonize others. And this is almost a cliche that we have trouble talking across the divide, but because peak woke is over, for example, and maybe we can now start extending woke to both the right and the left. Now that it's over, the people who think that way are standing out to me as uniquely hostile. And
people, excuse me, just so I understand, people who think in the woke register.
Who demonize people on the other side, who actually suppose that the people on the other side have nefarious aims, are bad people if they don't agree with you. And sometimes I think that they really do feel that way, and frankly, that they're not given to analytical thinking. Sometimes I think that a lot of it is a kind of performance art, and therefore isn't real, and therefore bothers me less than if people actually are under the impression that there are devils among us. But that wearies me these days. This has been a year when that kind of intolerance is something I've thought a lot about and frustrated about, and it's regrettable.
Excuse me, but do you not acknowledge that you are occasionally yourself given to that kind of intolerance, particularly when it comes to Donald J. Trump?
No, because as I always say, I find it a challenge to understand why he's so popular, especially with certain kinds of people. But notice I always say, I'm not going to say that they're all bad or that they're all dumb. That's not the way to think. I'm resisting it. And I don't mean to be sanctimonious, but I watch a lot of other people who don't. They're very comfortable thinking that way. And it's sad to watch, and it makes it hard to have intelligent conversations sometimes.
You think DEI is dying or has had the final nail in its coffin with the Trump election?
Not nail in the coffin, because they'll just start giving things different names, given that DEI is a euphemism for affirmative action already. But yes, something happened this year. And I think it started with what happened last January with Claudine Gay and Harvard and the accusations of plagiarism against her, which led many people to say she had been a DEI hire anyway, which then continued with Christopher Rufo and Bill Ackman and people connected with them finding endless plagiarism in various DEI quote unquote dissertations. And that helped put the whole structure under a certain magnifying glass. And so, yeah, notice that it has a taste in the mouth that it didn't have 2 years ago. Yeah, I think that there's going to be a questioning of how large these DEI organizations get and how much effect they have. And notice especially the falling away of the loyalty oaths that new professors were expected to sign, saying that their work is committed to diversity even when they're particle physicists. I was always dreading that somehow I was going to have to sign one of those because, frankly, I wouldn't. I would leave a job rather than do that. But notice that schools are dropping that requirement. And so that's a good sign too. What do you think?
Oh, I think the movement, if you could call it that, for diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging, for racial equity has taken fatal blows. I think the Supreme Court's decision in that Students for Fair Admissions case was a mortal wound, undercutting the legal foundation for racially conscious public action aimed at producing more equitable or equal results. I think a lot of the rhetoric on behalf of that project, the project of affirmative action and equity, not equality, a lot of the underpinnings for it have been kicked away. I think you mentioned Claudine Gay and the identification of pro-equity, DEI, diversity sentiment in the institutions of higher education with pro-Hamas, anti-Israeli sentiment. That ain't gonna work, man. That dog don't hunt. That's asking for trouble, and I think many of the principals in such institutions have found that trouble by trying to split the difference on these questions. I think the election of Trump and the way in which he was elected, with a lot of support, increase of support in minority communities, has undercut this. I think you're not going to be hearing any serious Democrat talk about reparations for slavery if they have national political aspirations in the future going forward. I think Christopher Rufo, I don't know that much about his background, but I know he's had a tremendous impact on the policy discussion, and I know he's got a lot of support. And, he's shrewd, he's effective. The Manhattan Institute and City Journal have had an outsized impact on the national discussion on these issues. And although I'd say it's all to the good. I mean, it can be a little bit rough around the edges, but, we, if I can say that, are winning this argument. I think if you were to try to do what was done in the summer of 2020 in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd, which is to say, burn that BITCH down kind of attitude, you wouldn't find a single prominent Democrat supporting it. What you did find, you're not going to get calls from national political candidates in the Democratic Party to the bedside of miscreants who have gotten into trouble with the police, but gotten into trouble with the police through their own indefensible behavior, consoling them and their families against the depredations of American racism and whatnot. I think you don't even have to bother, and I'll stop. I know I'm going on. You don't even have to bother with defund the police is a bad idea. Nobody's going to be saying defund the police. I mean, the idea that people were running around talking about defund the police, I think the Soros prosecutors, we could name them in city after city around the country, are on the run or have been voted out of, recalled from office, and their program of, no cash bail, don't prosecute low-level offenses, look the other way at quality of life, depredations of, homeless people sleeping, defecating, doing drugs, et cetera, et cetera. That argument is not going to get 30% support at the polls. So, I think it's over. I think there's some stuff that it advocated that's worth trying to preserve, but I actually have my doubts about whether or not it can be preserved. What do I mean? I mean, it's one thing to say we're a colorblind society. It's another thing to say I don't take any notice of racial disparities in imprisonment, income and wealth, participation in elite programs and such, because race doesn't matter. One of those positions, we're a colorblind society and we don't do racial discrimination, is entirely consistent with the recognition that there are historical legacies of past depredations which warrant our attention, even if we attend to them in colorblind ways. The other is basically saying race is over. Let's move on and talk about something else. And I think we're a lot closer to the latter than the former. So I think it's epic.
Definitely something's happening, and I hope it's epic. Of course, the way change happens is that there are always going to be the holdouts, and I'm equally struck by them. So, for example, summer of 23, I was surprised. I think I've talked about this here before, so I'll just briefly say that Henry Louis Gates sponsors this discussion on Martha's Vineyard in the summers in August, and he invited me in the summer of 23. And it's a well-heeled, educated, mostly Black audience, a Martha's Vineyard kind of audience. And to be honest, I had gotten used to being able to get through to audiences about what you do with racial preferences in the 21st century. And I just figured, things have changed since my days at Berkeley when I was surrounded by people who were, very hard left on it and, practically assaulting me in the streets sometimes. But, I found that I could not get through to that audience. They were, nobody was throwing anything at me, but my idea that we need to base this now on socioeconomics and it shouldn't be about skin color. Suddenly I was transported back to 1995. It just wasn't going to work. But
this was after the Supreme Court had handed down its decision.
Yeah, this was after the decision. As a matter of fact, that was why we were talking about it. Randall Kennedy, God bless him, would not have any of it and raised his voice after something that I said. Lawrence Tribe bitch slapped me from a monitor. I was just, and, life goes on. But I remember thinking, wow, these people haven't changed on this at all, and they're never going to. Or another example, and I'm going to name a name because nothing bad happened. Where was I? Sometime earlier this year, in March, I was at UT Austin, and I watched our friend Coleman Hughes in conversation with Anil Joseph, who is a Black history professor.
I know who he is.
Written books. Yeah. And, he was friendly, but impenetrable about these things. He was not going to budge. However, I think he and I are about the same age. I wonder if it's different among people a generation below. And I hope it is because, what is the adage that in science, things change by people dying, not by people changing their mind. I with no disrespect, I would have to say some of this might be that kind of thing. There are people who are getting on who I get the feeling just can't move on this. But yes, definitely the conversation has changed a lot over the past couple years. That's definitely true. The Overton window is changing.
Now, some people are going to say, the usual suspects, that this is just another manifestation of racism, American style, that the indifference to the persisting disparities, the hostility to a political movement aimed at addressing them, the embrace of this philosophically thin position of race blindness. These are just 21st century manifestations of a very old malady. What would you say? I mean, you can imagine that argument. You can probably make that argument. How would you refute it? Or have you already done so and I missed that column in the New York Times?
No, I don't think I've written that column, but there will always be people who say that. And frankly, it's reductive. I mean, there's a certain kind of person who thinks they're doing their job by showing that what happened last week is really the same thing as what happened 50 years ago. And sometimes it is, but just as often it isn't. And to say that people who are against peak woke are just racists in a new garb and don't care about society and progress. It's simply not true. I mean, if you actually sit and read what people, frankly, like you and me and everybody else in our corner are saying, none of us need to be taught what racism is or how it works. We just have a different sense of what you do about it. Now, if you go on certain social media, I mean, I am struck on Twitter by a certain kind of person that, especially Musk's treatment of the site, has encouraged. There are racists out there. There are white guys who seem to specialize in showing data and making points that are the kind of thing that would get you kicked off of any university campus. Yeah, there are those people. There's no reason in the world to suppose that those people are the most powerful, however, or that they have the ear of anybody with power. So yeah, life is never perfect, but no, that's not what's going on at all. Those people are unable to see that their way of looking at things is subject to coherent criticism as well. And I've certainly encountered many of them who feel that when it comes to race, their views are just truth, that they're on the side of the angels. But frankly, they're not. The hard thing is getting them to listen long enough to understand. So you have to make other people listen to you. They're not going to change. But no. Everything today is not like 50 years ago. It becomes a puerile exercise after a while. Or frankly, sometimes I wonder if people are running out of things to say. And so they start thinking about black and white film and John Lewis, et cetera, and Bull Connor, when really a lot of time has passed and there are other ways to think about things.
Ground News is the website and app that I use every day to inform myself, cut through the news, and find the truth. They gather articles from over 50,000 news sources around the world and help you break free from big tech algorithms and echo chambers. Go to ground.news/Glenn Show to see how it works for yourself. Let me tell you about my favorite Ground News feature. It's called the Blind Spot feed, and it shows you stories that are disproportionately reported by either the left or the right. It's really helpful for gaining a balanced perspective on our hyper-polarized world. Here's a story left-leaning outlets cover and right-leaning ones don't tend to. Facebook restricts Palestinian news but boosts Israel's BBC research. Conversely, here's a story mostly reported by sources on the right and ignored by the left. Russia claims to have developed cancer vaccine. Plans free distribution. For both of these, as for every story, Ground News gives you a breakdown of how many news sources covered it, the biased distribution of the media outlets reporting across the left, center, and right, how reliable these sources have been in the past, and who owns them. You can't get this type of news analysis anywhere else. For a limited time, my viewers can get 50% off the Unlimited Access Vantage plan. This is their best deal of the year. If you're already a subscriber, you can send Ground News as a gift to family or friends for 50% off, too. There's nothing better than giving the gift of perspective. So, make sure you use my link at ground.news/Glenn Show. Click the link in the description or scan the QR code when signing up. That's ground.news/Glenn Show. Yeah. You think Musk has encouraged or has he simply allowed? I mean, his non-censorship thing may have, quote, encouraged, close quote, in the sense that people feel they can post without fear of consequence. But what has Musk done to, in some more substantive way, encourage this line of thinking?
Thank you for making me clearer on that. Yeah, I'm not saying that Musk was trying to have racist content out front. That would be like being like the other people. He's not. He's a piece of work, but he's not evil. No, but his loosening the controls and the censorship meant that a certain kind of person is now much more confident. And what else Musk would be doing to make them more prominent, I have no reason to think there's anything. But it's a dirtier place than it was even a year ago. Because of, and the people leaving for Blue Sky, et cetera.
In the news this week in New York City is the jury's decision to acquit Daniel Penny of murder charges in the death of Jordan Neely, of the homeless and mentally ill man who was harassing riders on a subway when Daniel Penny, ex-Marine and rider on that subway car, took it upon himself to subdue him. The consequence of which was that Jordan Neely expired. He was in a chokehold, and the chokehold proved to be a fatal move. It wasn't the intention of the ex-Marine good citizen to kill him, but he did kill him. He was charged by Alvin Bragg with a serious criminal offense, but
Your
a
friend
jury
Alvin Bragg. Yeah.
well, he is who he is. Alvin Bragg is. That decision, the prosecutorial discretion was deployed the way it was deployed. It was controversial, and there was a trial, and the verdict has been rendered. What's your take on that overall controversy? A lot of people are upset. I should mention that Jordan Neely was black and Daniel Penny is white, but we can make of that what we will. I gather from your piece in the New York Times that you don't want to make a big deal out of one being black and the other white, but more broadly, how do you read that situation, the jury's decision, the reactions to it, and so on?
Well, quite simply, if Jordan Neely, the one who was unfortunately killed, was white, this would have been a local New York story for about 2 days. The whole thing was made into a whole thing because of the racial aspect of it. And it's highly indicative of the kind of mindsets that we're talking about. Because there's a certain kind of person who thinks that Neely needed to be engaged somehow, that he needed help. And he clearly did. He was somebody who was on the street, clearly having major psychotic breaks, and the system failed him. He shouldn't have been out and about. Now, of course, there are people who still subscribe to that fashionable early, mid-1960s idea that we have to temper what we think of as crazy and that we're not supposed to take people like him in against their will. That's a whole other issue. But no, he was failed by the system. He certainly did not deserve to be killed, and Daniel Penny certainly did not mean to kill him. But some people say, well, he needed to be engaged. But I'm not sure that those people ride the New York subway. I think there are other people. And I think it because I've seen it. I've heard it in conversation, and you see it in social media. There's a certain kind of person who thinks that white people in particular deserve him, Jordan Neely. He's running up and down the subway car saying menacing things with the body gestures. And, who knows if he's got a gun on him or a knife? You don't know. And really, I think a lot of people think that Karen, quote unquote, is supposed to put up with him because she is warp and woof, part of the warp and woof of a racist society. And so she deserves Jordan Neely. And I think most of the people who feel that way are white women in my experience. But I also know that anybody who feels that way is highly unlikely to live a New York City life. And I have been too often in a subway car with someone like that. You don't know what they're going to pull. Literally, they might have something on them. It's a limited space. Often you have a long time in between stops, and sometimes the damn train stops. And you're sitting there, and suppose your number comes up. And frankly, people do get killed in the subway too often. And so you're sitting there thinking, oh God, and you're hoping this person doesn't seize upon you. If you make eye contact, he might, but if you don't, especially if you're black, he thinks you're dissing him and then starts bothering you. I have had that happen to me. And if you're sitting there on the train with your children, and what are your children thinking? And what might you not be able to do? That's how it feels. And so when this ex-Marine takes that guy down, frankly, I'm not waiting for him to be killed, but Daniel Penny was doing a good thing because that person needs to be detained. And who knows what Jordan Neely was going to do because he was out of his mind. And Karen doesn't deserve that.
Okay.
And that.
Well, I was just going to try to fashion a pushback to say, needs to be detained, perhaps, but through a process of medical treatment that respects his humanity, needs to be restrained on the floor of a subway car with a man's bent arm around his neck, holding him so that he can't move and he can't breathe. Does he need that? That's a position that you have yet to argue for. He needs to be cared for. is different from he needs to be dealt with.
Sure.
Sounds like you're saying the latter.
Well, he does need to be dealt with, unfortunately. I mean, unless somebody has some medicine in a syringe and they can just put it on his shoulder, he needs to be taken out of the car. And the only way to do it is either for two people to grab him, but maybe there aren't going to be two people who have the wherewithal to do that, or one person needs to grab him. And ideally, what would have happened there is he would have been in the chokehold for maybe 1 minute and then just pulled out of the car and let go on the platform, and maybe some police officers could have dealt with him. It was a tragedy that the man died. I'm not saying that that's what should have happened. It's a terrible thing. You read about his whole life story. But
needs to be cared for, needs services, needs a place to go, needs a sympathetic intervention. I mean, where's that in your calculation?
That should have happened long before. Jordan Neely needed serious help. I mean, the fact that there's so many people like him in the subway right now really does have me rethinking whether I want to live in this city any longer than I absolutely have to. It's a real problem. But to think mostly of the fact that the system had failed him and to dismiss Daniel Penny for what he did, as if it isn't equally urgent that this person who's out of their mind and threatening or talking in a violent way should be detained right then, is somebody with an astounding lack of empathy for what it's like to be in the New York subway. Unless, I suppose, you are a 400-pound, very muscular male. But then again, suppose this person has a gun.
Has a knife or a gun or a razor blade or
just
mace.
A razor blade. Yeah. And so it's
But excuse me, John, you're not worried about encouraging more Daniel Pennies of the world to act? I mean, this situation that you're describing sounds like something that happens every day in a subway car somewhere in New York City. There are going to be thousands of opportunities for Good Samaritan types to intervene and take action into their own hands. And is that a world that you would feel comfortable inviting to come into existence?
Yes, because his being killed was an accident. It's not necessary that whenever someone is detained like that they're going to die. It's not absolute. The fact that happened to Jordan Neely and it's gotten so much attention would mean that people would pay particular attention to someone not dying more likely. There were people standing there even then saying you're holding him for too long. And Daniel Penny apparently didn't understand. I think it sells people short to suppose that if more people detained these extremely disturbed men, that we would be all but ensuring that more of them would die. Daniel Penny was an ex-Marine. Like I could not have killed anybody that way. I don't have the training. I'm probably not strong enough. It was a freakish thing that happened there. I will never forget one time being on the train, luckily without my girls. And there was a guy walking up and down the train car and larger than Daniel Penny and with a kind of a cocky pride about him. I hate to say black guy, maybe Blacktino, but probably black. And
isn't it almost always, isn't it almost always a black guy?
It is almost always a black person.
That's
not
very
Latino,
significant.
Black person. And black man. And he's doing this and he's clearly enjoying himself. I'm not sure whether he was crazy or just drunk and angry. It was hard to tell, but he was giving the women a really hard time, including, I remember this small Latina mother sitting there with her food. Her English might not even have been that good, but even if it wasn't, he's sitting there looking her in the face, clearly enjoying scaring everybody in the car half to death. And there were two police officers out there on the platform as we got to each stop, and, none of them are doing anything. And, I just thought, this isn't right. And for somebody to say that person shouldn't be detained because they're clearly having problems, no society owes that guy that. He needed to be pulled out of the train, and I don't think he would have been killed in the process. He probably needed to be taken either into treatment or jail for the night or something. But he needed to leave all these women alone. And Lord forbid if I had said anything to him because I'm this snotty brother, and, he would have torn my head off. So...
No, you take your life into your hands if you engage somebody in a situation like that.
Because he might have a knife or a gun or a razor blade, exactly.
And as you point out, it doesn't matter whether you're 6'3" and 250, built like a linebacker or not. You could bleed out right there from a slash across your throat. from one of these people. So I definitely see the problem.
Now, there's a certain kind of person who's saying we're demonizing those guys. But no, this is the truth. And if you think we're demonizing these guys, you don't ride the train. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, well, I don't ride the train, but I can empathize with and you being there with your kids and feeling intimidated. I mean, think about the feelings of power. I mean, I gather this goes both ways. I think on the performance that is so intimidating is a kind of power play on the part of the individual who's engaged in it, right? I mean, he's taking control or command. He's daring you to do something. He's in your face. Whatever internal psychological benefits he is getting from it, power has something to do with it, dominating that situation, daring you. I mean, and when you don't get up, I mean, I can imagine myself sitting there being intimidated and feeling anger for the fear that has been induced in me, and recognizing, I'm not getting up because I'm afraid of the consequences of getting up. This dude is in my face, and I'm hoping that he moves on to the next person. Oh my God, isn't that a position of weakness? How pathetic, how sad. My pride is wounded by being affronted in that way. I just had a thought. If Daniel Penny had been a police officer, if instead of being a former military service person, he had had a uniform, a police unit of New York's finest, and he had subdued Jordan Penny, wouldn't it be an Eric Garner 2.0 kind of case? Wouldn't the Al Sharpton people, some of whom I gather were chanting outside of the courtroom, have been 10 times as many of them on the streets? And wouldn't the editorial opinion been much less friendly to the guy who subdued Jordan Neely than had proven to be the case here? And what do we have to say about that?
Well, frankly, that's absolutely true. And more to the point, let's make him a black ex-Marine, and let's make him real. I want to say he's Howard Morris, but that reference is getting too old. Let's say that it's Wesley Snipes, as if that's brand new. But
if anybody remembers who Wesley Snipes, the actor,
let's make it Coleman Domingo. He's a black ex-Marine, and he takes down this Jordan Neely and accidentally kills him. All those black people who were protesting outside of the trial last week would be out there too, exclaiming that we have to understand that Coleman Domingo is innocent. We have to understand that he didn't do it on purpose. Don't put a black man in prison once again without taking his humanity into account. All the people would be furious at the prospect that person might go to jail. But if it's this blonde white guy, then it's the same story that we've always seen since 1619. It's that reductive thinking again. So I did my Times piece about that. And what's interesting is you talk about, we're bringing some threads together here, things changing. That one, frankly, I don't walk around tabulating these things. That one has been very well received. I have gotten an awful lot of messages from people of all colors saying that I just, made a valid point, as opposed to I've seen a trickle of things, accusing me of, not understanding that what Daniel Penny did had to be motivated at least on some level by racism. This is the same old story, black man killed by a white man. But that's not as dominant as I think it would have been if this happened 25 years ago. I think people are beginning to see sense. That's all, just common sense. And so, yeah, there's been a change, because if that had happened in 2020, Daniel Penny would have been asked to leave the planet. Can you imagine? Whereas, things are different now.
John and I often talk about higher education on this podcast, obviously. That's the universe we both inhabit. And why not? It's a topic that has moved front and center of late at both the state and national level. Free speech on campus, viewpoint diversity on campus, cancel culture on campus, soaring tuition, affirmative action, race-based admissions, accreditation, the erosion of standards, attacks on the classics, hiring litmus tests, critical race theory, diversity, equity, and inclusion. You name it, it's in the news. So, with all that's going on, and there's a lot going on, To whom can one turn as a trusted resource of all issues related to campus reform, whether you're a student, faculty, trustee, administrator, donor, policymaker, or alumni? One source we want you to know about and strongly recommend as a credible and respected voice on all these issues is the American Council of Trustees and Alumni, or ACTA, whom we're pleased to have supporting this episode. ACTA is on the front lines, promoting academic excellence, academic freedom, and accountability at America's colleges and universities. They don't just serve as trusted advisors to college trustees and alumni, they help arm reformers with resources, ideas, recommendations, information, even grassroots alumni support through their Campus Freedom Initiative. They make positive changes happen, and they approach these issues in a nonpartisan, balanced, informed, highly credible way, which we appreciate. If you care deeply about these issues, as John and I do, you really must know more about the American Council of Trustees and Alumni. Start by looking them up on the web at goacta.org. That's goacta.org. And follow them on Twitter and Facebook. The other big story in New York City the last week is the assassination of a chief executive officer of United Healthcare by someone who has been alleged to have done it. And there seems to be a fair amount of evidence to that effect, and he's in custody. And there's a controversy that has emerged about how people have reacted to the assassination, with the assailant getting a lot more sympathetic reactions, perhaps, than is justifiable, but that is taken to be an expression of the deep dissatisfaction that many people have with the healthcare system and with the insurance companies' management of their portfolios, the discretion that they exercise over people's access to care and, delay, deny, etc. What do you make of that? Your paper has been covering it extensively. I saw this morning a summary of all of the op-eds and editorial commentary that has been printed there. You got thoughts about that?
It kind of comes back to that business of demonizing the other side. It's one thing to hate the healthcare system. It's another thing to understand that the people participating in it need not be seen as themselves driving the injustice just because in the abstract sense they're part of it. It's kind of like the white person who's supposed to feel like they are responsible for societal racism because they live in the society. It's a forced Robin DiAngelo kind of argument that people pretend to agree with. Same thing here. And so you watch this man who's a father, and a spouse, killed in cold blood, no expectation. He's just gone. And you cheer, especially because he's a white man. If it was a black man, people would not be cheering, even if he worked for the healthcare system. If he's white, then it's okay to.
I'm not so sure about that.
Cheer.
But okay.
Imagine if it was, just imagine that man black, and he's killed on the street. I think people would hold back because he was brown skinned. I'm picturing just randomly Ben Carson, although he's a little older now. And I'm not saying that Ben Carson, I have any problem with him or anything. But if somebody of that, like that,
okay,
shot. And so, but then also you saw this online kind of, I'm losing a word, this online glorification of the shooter, including, finding him sexy. And, there was a contest already this week in the city with people dressing up to be him and things like that. And really, it's as if people think of all this as a kind of sport. They're looking at it all with a kind of irony. And I think that's social media's fault. It lets you see too much too often, and you end up having kind of a distance from what you should really be thinking of as real life. It's the same thing as peak woke having partly been about everything going on Slack and Zoom, where you've got this distance that encourages a sort of tribalism and a dehumanization of people. So, it's been a scary week in New York. Just thinking about what happened to Jordan Neely, worrying that Daniel Neely was about to have his life ruined for something that he did by accident. And then somebody getting killed in cold blood on the street and people on social media cheering the killer and cheering at this man's death. I'm not usually given to melodrama, but I was thinking this week, where are we? What have we come to that all of these things are happening? It can be very, very frustrating. Crazy people, crazy violent people in the subway. Daniel Penny is, basically a white lyncher, and there's controversy over this. And then an executive gets killed in cold blood on the street. People applaud and start putting up sexy pictures of his killer. What a week,
Well, there's a sentiment out there. I think it was exemplified by something I saw. Brianna Joy Gray, the podcaster with Nathan Robinson, I think that's his name.
She makes such a fool of herself about Israel. I can say nothing but that. And Nathan Robinson is literally the most obnoxious interviewer I have ever encountered. He's a loathsome little creature. Anyway, go ahead.
Well, I don't know that I agree about Israel. I'm not sure what you're referring to, but I know she has arch views. But Robinson certainly lived up to the billing that you just gave him in this particular segment that I'm talking about. And they were talking, kind of laughing behind their hands, kind of smugly. They were saying, oh, of course, we don't endorse violence. But isn't it curious and interesting how many people, for example, think the guy, I'm sorry, I don't remember his name.
Luigi Mangione.
Luigi Mangione is sexy. That he has a kind of heroic coloration to him that he's somehow standing in for. Again, they would be quick to say we don't endorse the violence, but and then there's the facial expressions. There's the kind of laughing behind the hand kind of thing that go on, and it really it turned my stomach. I didn't care for it at all. I thought it was small. I thought it was so small. I thought they had crawled into the hole that the social media nutcase posters, the people who put up comments to explicitly celebrate the act, because after all, health insurance companies are bad people in the U.S. We ought to have universal health care. We ought to have Medicare for all. We don't have it. They get what they deserve. They're all about profits. Corporations. That kind of sentiment, which you expect to pop up in a free-for-all kind of exchange in a country of 330 million people. But you would think that wiser commentators would stand back from it a bit and would not wallow in this thing. I mean, after all, somebody is going to have to say no sometime to somebody's request for health care. Whether it's an insurance company that has a bottom line that they're trying to protect, or it's a bureaucrat who's administering a national health service thing and is saying, no, that particular treatment, you can't have it, or you can't have it for 6 months or whatever. There's going to be frustration because there are limited resources, and those resources have to be rationed, and everybody can't get everything that they want now. So it's kind of, I'm not endorsing every insurance company's decision in every case. That's not my point. My point is that life means limited resources, and that applies to healthcare as well as everything else. Everybody's not going to get every treatment that they want all the time because the resources are limited, period. You think there's not going to be rationing of access to healthcare in a system which is not run by private insurance companies? There is going to be, because, again, surgeons' time is limited. Drugs are costly. Everybody is not going to get Ozempic. It's $1,000 a month. It could be life-saving. Who are you going to blame for the fact that whatever the rationing mechanism is, they don't universally hand out something that costs $1,000 a month? They're going to ration it based upon an assessment of the imperative to have this treatment as a part of a larger vision about providing health care. There's always going to be disappointment in that. And that's, you don't think in the National Health Service in Britain, people are disappointed by the decisions that get made, et cetera. So anyway, I ramble. Brianna Joy Gray and Nathan Robinson really upset me a little bit by the smugness and the glee. There was a schadenfreude, I guess is what you want to call it. There was a suppressed kind of a celebration of this thing. And do we want to live in a world in which radical anarchists go around taking out CEOs of companies. What about the housing crisis and foreclosing on loans of people who can't pay their mortgages? Do those executives deserve to be assassinated, etc.?
Yeah, this is hard, intelligent leftists. And it's hard to get through with people like that. In that, okay, let's say that there are problems with the healthcare system, that there are reasonable complaints that go beyond the rather Sowell-esque explanation that you just gave, that there are limited resources, of course, but many people would say too limited in many cases and that injustice is being done. The question is, does it mean that that 50-year-old guy who was a cog in the system deserved to be killed by an extremely peculiar and rather self-involved 26-year-old? And is it appropriate, given the problems with the healthcare system, to find him to be a kind of anti-hero for doing this? And would you feel that way if you were on the street when it happened and you watched that gun being fired and that man falling to the ground? Or are you thinking of it as spectacle because you only see it on your phone? Yeah, I didn't see this segment, but there's something wrong with that. That's not the way it's supposed to be. But yeah, it's tough. He in particular, this Luigi, is an interesting case because it's hard to see so far exactly why he went the direction that he did. You were waiting for somebody who didn't grow up with much money, who's got a resentment against society, etc. And then it turns out to be this rich, privileged, rather brilliant, literate person who has back problems. And trying to get from A to B on this one is tough. But no, there was nothing heroic or sexy about what went on there. I'm always surprised that people can feel that way, especially about parents. It's and it's not that it isn't tragic.
As victims, parents as victims.
Just a spouse. But yeah, when that person has kids, and I hate to return to this, but frankly, Ta-Nehisi Coates, in his book Between the World and Me, saying that he couldn't develop any feeling for the firefighters who died in 9/11.
I remember that.
And the thing is, those guys were parents. I mean, they're people to this day, they're 22 and 23-year-olds who lost their father in that. And yet he can't develop any feeling for them because they're white. That struck me as a really cold aspect.
Because they represent the cops and the authority and whatnot. They're from Staten Island and they're a part of a conservative
and they might have some racist views, and they're one step from being
Almost
cops
surely.
who can break his black body, as he put it. But wow, that was cold after 9/11.
I remember that about Coates' book, Between the World and Me, and it was one of the things that really most disturbed me about it. But it was emblematic of a more general posture in that book, which I rejected categorically and really resented, as a matter of fact. Because it's precious. It elevates your concerns above your obligations as a citizen. The country was attacked. The people died in the thousands. It was an absolute catastrophe. Those people who lost their lives in those collapsing buildings heroically. Can you imagine being called upon to do that?
Mm-hmm.
They did it. They did it unflinchingly. They went into that building and they never came out again. And all you have to say is they're white and they're a part of the system, and you brag about feeling nothing. I thought that was contemptible.
My blood pressure is going up a little bit right now just thinking about I was out in Berkeley when that happened, and part of my Bildung in German, my education that kind of led me to become the apostate that I am, is how many people out there were rather similar on this. I was thinking, I feel more American than I ever have. We were attacked for a rather abstract reason, and a huge number of people died, and they're probably going to do it again, you thought at that time. And I thought, wow, I feel so bad for what happened to the people in those buildings. And I was all the way across the country. And for a lot of people in Berkeley, no. For them, nobody would say it in so many words, but they thought that those Arab men had scored a victory, that they had, it was unfortunate what Osama bin Laden did, but it was a statement from them that was long overdue here in this country. And it seemed that hating on George W. Bush was more important to them than having a genuine sympathy or empathy for what had happened in those buildings. That really made me mad because, and it's funny you say pose, At the time, I remember thinking, this feels fake to me. It feels there's a performative aspect of looking at this way. It's as if they feel like it's doing this that makes them good people. And then you kind of extend that to some of my views about the race conversation. I thought it isn't real.
Well,
and I never lost that. I never left that feeling.
There's another dimension to it. I think they're saying chickens come home to roost. I think they're saying you reap what you've sown. I think they're saying, yes, this was a terrible thing. Some of them, the better of them, are saying this was a terrible thing. But, and the but is, there's a context, there's a history, there's a grounding. The U.S. meddling in, look how much blood we have on our hands, look at, et cetera. And now this thing comes back and blows up on us. Well, it's not like I'm glad it happened, but I'm not surprised it happened. This kind of attitude. What would you say to that?
It depends on where their feelings really are. Context isn't, and it's so obvious. Another situation where this whole question comes up that we have discussed. Yes, there is context, and you have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. Yes, sometimes you need to keep two things in mind. Where I don't get it is where you can tell that what's in their heart is the context. And the tragedy is something that they think of as, some actuarial numbers, something they'd really rather not think about. So if what you're thinking is score one for Osama bin Laden, I'm glad that my country was given that message. And that's what's in your belly. And then what's in your brain is, gosh, 3,000 people did die. But Osama, I didn't get that. I didn't understand it, and I got in a lot of trouble. I gave an interview on NPR, where boy, did that kind of person jump at me for weeks because I was not nice about it. I talked about those people sipping their Chardonnay, but no, and that I have a problem with that. It's one thing to have the context is one thing, but if what you really feel in your belly is that happening is something which in the grand scheme of things, I can't say was the worst thing in the world. If you're cheering for them, I have a hard time wrapping my head around it. And then I get even angrier because I don't want to demonize. And I'm not saying people like that are demons, but it's an infuriating way of looking at things to me.
Seems to me a situation like that, the U.S. is attacked by terrorists and thousands are killed, has built into it a demand to choose sides. And part of the frustration, I speak for myself, but I think it could apply to you as well, is that when the event happens and when the instinct is to side with our people, I'm talking about Americans, I'm talking about identifying with those firefighters who lost their lives, or those people on those airplanes that were condemned. I mean, those last moments before the plane hit the building. God, I've been on many an airplane, man. I just can't imagine what that had to feel like. Yeah. I'm going to die. And I identify with those people because they're my people, because the United States was attacked. Never mind all of this geopolitical gibberish about U.S. responsibility for whatever. In the moment, I identify with those people. Those are my people. It could have been me. That was my side that was attacked. Yeah, it hasn't got anything to do with me being black. It does have a lot to do with me being born in Chicago in 1948, a natural-born citizen of the United States of America under attack. My country.
Mm-hmm.
And my first thought under those circumstances is, well, the U.S. had it coming because after all, they shouldn't have started the war in Iraq in 2003. Because Osama bin Laden was a creature in Afghanistan of the CIA trying to promote anti-Soviet agitation and et cetera, et cetera.
And our support for Israel. And I just thought those things are too abstract.
That's my point.
Yeah, they're too abstract.
To trump my identification with my people in my country under attack.
Under physical attack, with, attempts at mass murder.
And there's something so self-indulgent about adopting the haughty, disconnected, above it all view that, well, it was only 2,500 in the World Trade Center attack, et cetera. The U.S. has killed tens upon tens upon tens of thousands. And, I'm not obligated to feel anything here except my contempt for American empire.
This is bringing me back to early cell phones And Nora Jones is at every party on the soundtrack. It's that era. Yeah, there were people who really felt this way, and they were saying it. They were saying it straight, and it was hard. It was really Yellowtail wine at every party. This is 2001, and wow, I didn't get it. I really didn't get it. I had to leave a dinner party once because of some of this stuff. Anyway, go ahead.
Really?
Yeah, I got into it with a guy, and I just
and
I
you
didn't
left.
I didn't like his attitude that he was absolutely right, and that my views must come from naivete, and otherwise I'm evil. And so I just had to get up and leave because I didn't want it to go where I could tell it was going. And he had never liked me anyway, and thought I was kind of a lightweight. And so, yeah, these things, that did happen. That was 2002, actually.
I have a final question for you. Is New York going to remain a sanctuary city under the administration of Eric Adams? Or do I read the tea leaves correctly to see in the newspaper with his public statements him beginning to position himself to say, maybe we should get some of these criminal aliens out of our city?
My guess, and I haven't followed that closely this week because there's been so much else, but my guess is that Adams is trying to do something that would rally a significant number of people behind him, given, what a precarious position his administration has been in until recently. He's a politician, and I think he really does believe that. I think he was pulling back on what could be seen as anti-immigrant sentiment for a while because he was in such a tough position. But maybe he's kind of going for broke now because, at least that might save him. But we'll have to see. For me, that's next week's story.
Yeah. All right, John, you got anything else for us this week?
I don't think so. No, I have to figure out what my next column is going to be. And I try not to do anything. It's either language, race, or music. And I try not to do the same things in a row. So if I did a race one, then it has to be language or music. And so I'm trying to think of that. But it means I'm not thinking about race right now as we record. So no, I don't think so.
You are on sabbatical, I hear, so you don't have to worry about getting your grades in at the end of the semester.
Thank God. I am so enjoying not having to do any of that right now. So I can just be home, not doing that. Sabbatical is a good thing. I recommend it.
Yeah, I'll look into that. This has been another conversation for The Glenn Show with John McWhorter. Thank you, John, for your time. Thanks, everybody, for your attention. We'll be back in a couple of weeks.
Thank you, Glenn, and have a good one, everybody.